She bought lunch for a stranger with her last dollar, not knowing he was the new CEO of the company she was interviewing with. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, painting the New York City sidewalk in mirrored glints of gray and the yellow blur of passing taxis. Riley Morgan pulled her thin coat tighter around her slim frame, her blonde hair damp and sticking slightly to her cheeks. In one hand, she clutched a folded, slightly crumpled resume. The ink had started to bleed at the edges from the damp, but she held onto it like it was made of gold. Another interview. Another chance. She thought. Maybe this time. Her stomach growled. A loud, hollow complaint that reminded her she'd skipped breakfast again. While waiting at the crosswalk, she glanced into her wallet. $4.16. Enough for a coffee or a bus ticket home. But not both. The light changed. She stepped forward, her worn boots splashing slightly in a shallow puddle. Just outside the corner deli, she saw him. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt and faded jeans had slipped on the wet pavement. A brown paper bag lay burst beside him, its contents a sandwich and a drink scattered and soaked on the gritty concrete. He winced as he tried to push himself up, one hand cradling his side. People streamed past him, their umbrellas forming a moving canopy of indifference. No one stopped. Riley didn't hesitate. She jogged over, kneeling beside him. "Are you okay, sir?" He looked up, surprised. Rain had darkened his hair and soaked through his sleeves. I think so," he said, his voice raspy. "Just bruised my pride. Mostly." She offered her hand, her grip surprisingly firm as she helped him to his feet. He dusted off his pants, glanced at the ruined lunch on the ground, and then gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle. "Well, there goes my lunch." Without a word, Riley turned and walked into the deli. A few minutes later, she emerged with a bottle of water and a fresh turkey sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She handed them to him. He blinked, stunned. "Miss. No. I can't accept that." "You don't need to," she said with a tired but kind smile. "You look like you need it more than I do." He took it hesitantly, still processing her kindness. He studied her for a moment, his gaze a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice low. "You don't even know me." Riley's smile softened. "I've been the one lying on the ground," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I know how it feels." There was a long pause. Then he nodded slowly, clearly moved. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "Truly." She gave a single nod, shoved her now empty hands into her coat pockets, and turned to go. "Wait," he called after her. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then called over her shoulder. "Riley." "Thank you, Riley," he said again. But she had already merged back into the crowd, not looking back. If she had, she might have seen him watch her walk away with a strange look in his eyes, something between wonder and deep contemplation. Riley's pace slowed as she rounded the next corner, stepping under a dry awning to catch her breath. She pulled out her wallet again. It was empty except for 4 coins. The rumble in her stomach returned. Louder now. A stark reminder of her choice. Her coat clung to her. Cold from the drizzle. She shook her head. Exhaled a shaky breath. And looked up at the tall glass building ahead of her, Valecorp. Her interview. The building loomed like a monument to a world she wasn't part of. Sleek. Intimidating. And impenetrable. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass door, a woman with wet hair. Tired eyes. And a paper-thin folder hugged to her chest like armor. She took a deep breath. Pushed the door open. And walked in. The lobby was another world, warm. Bright. With marble floors that smelled of coffee and citrus cleaning products. People in tailored suits moved with a brisk confidence she envied. She approached the front desk. "Hi," she said. Her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here for a 1 p.m. interview. Riley Morgan." The receptionist gave a brief, professional nod. Scanned a list. And smiled. "Yes. MS. Morgan. You're on the list. Take the elevator to the 22nd floor." Riley murmured a thank you and turned toward the bank of elevators. As the polished metal doors slid shut behind her, she looked at her reflection again. She didn't have lunch. She didn't have money. She didn't have a clean record. But she still had her name. And for now, that would have to be enough. The elevator chimed softly as Riley stepped onto the 22nd floor of Valecorp. The carpet beneath her worn boots felt too plush. Too clean. As if each step she took left behind an invisible shadow of her struggle. The receptionist gestured toward a glass-walled waiting area filled with a few other applicants, sleek, confident, and impeccably dressed. Riley smoothed her hair in the reflection of a glass panel, tucking the damp strands behind her ears. She hugged the folder to her chest again. A flimsy shield against her insecurities. Across the floor, behind a tinted wall, a figure stood with a tablet in hand. Watching. It was Ethan Vale, the CEO. He now wore a tailored jacket. The weathered flannel shirt and scuffed boots from earlier that day gone. But his eyes hadn't changed. They were still observant. Still quietly searching. And he saw her. The same woman who had handed him her last meal. Her eyes heavy with exhaustion but her voice steady with kindness. The woman who had walked away without asking for anything in return. Not even his name. He hadn't expected to see her again. And certainly not here. For a long moment. He said nothing. Then, slowly, he turned away. He would listen first. Learn who she was when she thought no one important was watching. Riley sat down in the waiting area. Her fingers toying with the worn edge of her resume. She glanced at the other candidates. Each scrolling confidently on their phones. Their leather portfolios gleaming. She felt like a smudge on clean glass. Riley Morgan. A voice called her name. She stood quickly. Following a woman in a dark green suit into a medium-sized conference room. 3 people were waiting, someone from HR. A department head. And a man from the legal team. Each one wore a practiced, professional smile. The first 10 minutes of the interview went smoothly. They asked about her work ethic. Her coding certifications. Her adaptability. Riley answered carefully and honestly. Feeling her confidence rise like a fragile balloon. Then came the moment she had learned to dread. One of the interviewers. The man from legal. Leaned forward slightly. His hands folded. We've reviewed your resume. MS. Morgan. But we also ran a standard background check. Riley's heartbeat didn't stop. But it braced itself for impact. She nodded. Yes. I expected that. The air in the room shifted. Growing colder. It shows a conviction for financial fraud. 2 years served. Do you care to elaborate? Riley looked each of them in the eye. There was no anger in her expression. No defensiveness, just the quiet weight of truth. I was 24. I worked as a junior accountant for a startup. I trusted the wrong person, my boyfriend at the time. He used my credentials to authorize transfers. When the investigation started, he disappeared. I had no proof to defend myself. No money for a better lawyer. And I had signed documents I didn't fully understand. Silence. She continued. Her voice quieter now. I went to prison for 2 years. My mother passed away while I was there. I missed her funeral. When I got out, I decided I wouldn't let that be the end of my story. One of the panelists cleared his throat. Another looked down at her resume. No longer with interest, but with cold calculation. I've worked part-time jobs since. Riley added, her voice regaining its firmness. No one wanted to take a chance. But I didn't stop learning. I've earned 3 new certifications on my own. I taught coding to kids at a local community center. I've stayed out of trouble. I've done the work. The air felt thick. Heavy. No one spoke. Behind the glass wall, Ethan watched. Absorbing every word. Every pause. This wasn't just a story. It was a confession wrapped in courage. She had told it not to gain sympathy, but because she refused to lie about who she was. Riley left the room 10 minutes later. Her shoulders squared. They had thanked her and said they'd be in touch. But the words were a hollow formality. She knew the tone. Outside the building, she stood under the awning again. The rain had stopped completely, and the clouds were beginning to break. She stared at the traffic, wondering if she had enough change for the bus or if she'd be walking home. From the executive floor high above, Ethan Vale stood with his arms crossed, watching her small figure through the tall windows. He remembered her voice. As clear as if she were standing next to him. I've been the one lying on the ground. I know how it feels. That voice didn't beg. It didn't blame. It had simply helped. Ethan's jaw tightened with resolve. He pressed a button on his office intercom. Hold her file, he said. His voice firm. Just 2 words. But they would change everything. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense. The hiring committee sat around the polished table. Resumes and background checks laid out in neat stacks. But none of the papers felt neat anymore. Not after Riley's interview. Barrett, the counsel from legal, cleared his throat. Flipping Riley's file closed with a quiet, final snap. Her answers were strong. No doubt. But the conviction. We simply can't ignore the liability. Monica from HR looked conflicted. And yet, she owned every part of it. She didn't deflect or make excuses. That has to mean something. But does it mean enough? Davis, the tech lead, murmured, rubbing the back of his neck. This is Vale Corp. We have a reputation to protect. We can't afford to risk that over a moment of compassion. It was then that the door opened. All heads turned. Ethan Vale stepped in. His presence immediately commanding the room. He wore no jacket. His sleeves rolled up casually. But his gaze was focused and sharp. In his hand, he held something small and worn, a flattened, empty sandwich wrapper. The deli's logo still faintly visible. He walked slowly to the center of the table and placed it down. No one spoke. Ethan looked up, meeting each of their eyes. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried an undeniable weight. Before you make a final decision, he said, let me tell you who Riley Morgan really is. The tension in the room shifted, replaced by a current of stunned curiosity. 3 days ago, I slipped and fell on the wet pavement outside a corner store. I fell hard. People walked past me. No one stopped. No one even looked. He tapped the sandwich wrapper gently with his finger. Except one person. She came out of nowhere. She helped me up without asking who I was. She saw I'd lost my lunch. So she walked into that store and spent what I now know were her last few dollars. He paused. Yes. I checked. She came back with this sandwich and a bottle of water and handed them to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Barrett shifted uncomfortably. You're saying that was her? Ethan nodded. She didn't know I was the CEO of this company. She didn't recognize me at all. She just saw someone who needed help. And she acted. Monica's eyes widened. Davis blinked. Speechless. Ethan continued. His voice firmer now. When I asked her why she did it, she said, I've been the one lying on the ground. I know how it feels. She didn't try to sell me a story. She didn't ask for anything in return. I watched her in that interview room own her past and carry it with a dignity most people will never know. Barrett interjected cautiously. But Ethan. The public perception. Our clients. Our investors. Ethan turned to him. His gaze unwavering. Perception is built on precedent. We set it. We define it. We can be a company that shuts its doors to people with scars. Or we can be one that recognizes healing takes courage. We can be a company that talks about character. Or we can be one that actually values it. He walked to the head of the table and folded his arms. As of today, I'm launching the Second Chance Initiative, a formal hiring policy designed to evaluate candidates based not only on their past mistakes, but on what they've done to rise from them. He looked around the table, letting his words sink in. Riley Morgan will be the first. She will not be the last. Davis let out a low breath. You're serious? Ethan offered a thin, determined smile. Dead serious. If we can build rockets that land themselves, we can build a company culture that knows how to forgive. He turned toward the door. Then paused. His hand on the handle. She starts Monday. He said. Make sure she has a desk. A team. And a real chance. And with that, he walked out, leaving behind the empty sandwich wrapper. But to those still sitting in the room, it felt like he had left something far heavier, a mirror. And a choice. On her first day at Vale Corp, Riley stood alone in the elevator. Her new ID badge clipped neatly to her jacket. She could feel her nerves curling like smoke under her skin. When the doors opened to her floor, a handful of employees glanced up. Some offered brief, polite nods. Others barely looked. A few whispered as she passed. By lunchtime, the tension was palpable. Quiet conversations at the coffee station that fell silent when she approached. The unspoken distance during the team stand-up. She wasn't just the new hire. She was the one with the story. She kept her head down, focused on her work, said thank you more than necessary, and only laughed when it felt absolutely safe. That afternoon, a small package arrived on her desk. Inside was a beautiful, leather-bound journal. On the cover, embossed in silver, were the words, "From Fall to Flight." There was no sender's name, but a note was tucked inside the first page. Every comeback begins with the courage to take the first step. Welcome to your flight. Riley smiled. A genuine, private smile. She opened the journal to the first blank page. It was an invitation to begin again. A few days later, she was invited to a quiet lunch session hosted by the company's new mentorship program. She almost didn't go, but something pushed her toward the conference room. To her surprise, the atmosphere was bright and casual. A few senior employees and some newer hires were there. Ethan stood at the back, unobtrusive, not speaking, just watching. Someone handed Riley a sandwich and motioned to an empty seat. By the end of the session, she had 3 new contacts, an offer for a coffee chat, and a sticky note left on her chair that said, "Glad you're here." The whispers didn't disappear overnight, but they began to fade, replaced by genuine curiosity and, eventually, respect. Riley proved herself not with words, but with work. Her code was clean. Her logic was sharp. And her dedication was undeniable. A year later, Vailcorp looked different. Not just in policy or performance, but in spirit. The walls felt warmer. The voices in the halls more sincere. The Second Chance initiative had become a cornerstone of the company's identity, celebrated in business journals. And at the center of it all was Riley. She stood backstage at a national conference, her heart beating fast as the host on stage read her name from a teleprompter. Behind him, a massive banner read, "Faces of Cultural Transformation, Building Companies that Forgive and Flourish." And now, please welcome the woman whose story of integrity and resilience inspired one of the most progressive hiring movements in our industry. The Director of Community Impact for Vailcorp, Riley Morgan. Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. Riley stepped onto the stage with a quiet grace. She didn't read from a script. She never did. "I used to think," she began, her voice clear and steady, "that redemption had to be earned through perfection. That you had to do something extraordinary to undo the worst chapter of your life. But I was wrong." She scanned the crowd of faces. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need someone to believe that the best parts of you still exist and are worth the risk." She paused, then smiled softly. "For me, that someone wore a wrinkled shirt, held an empty lunchbox, and decided a stranger's kindness was more valuable than a clean record." A few people in the audience laughed gently. "I didn't have a polished resume or a polished past," she continued, "but I had a heart that wanted to try again." She grinned. "That And a sandwich. The room broke into warm, heartfelt applause. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Riley slipped out a side entrance. The evening sky had turned a soft shade of peach. Ethan was waiting for her under a tree. He had skipped the spotlight, as he always did. But he had been there, watching from the back row. He stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, his eyes searching hers. "You were incredible," he said simply. Riley shrugged, a small, happy smile playing on her lips. "I just told the truth." They stood there for a moment, a comfortable silence settling between them. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and folded the familiar paper note from the journal he'd given her. Every comeback begins with the courage to take the first step. "Welcome to your flight. I've watched you," Ethan said, his voice low and full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Not just succeed, but lift others up with you. You've changed lives. You changed mine." Riley blinked, caught off guard. "I never told you this," Ethan continued, his gaze intense. "But before I met you, I was close to walking away from all of it. This job, this company. I'd lost faith in the people I was supposed to lead." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "And then you helped me when you had nothing. You reminded me what character looks like." She smiled, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I didn't have anything that day," she whispered. "Just a sandwich." Ethan stepped closer, closing the small space between them. "I've waited to say this for a very long time," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that made her heart stand still. "Riley, I'm in love with you." Her breath caught. In that moment, all the noise, the doubts, the whispers, the memories of prison bars and cold stares faded into nothing. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "Me too." 2 years later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, Riley and Ethan sat on a park bench, sharing a simple lunch from a corner deli. Not far away, a group of teenagers from the community center kids Riley still mentored were learning to code on laptops provided by a VailCorp grant. The Second Chance initiative was now a national model, and Riley was its heart. But here, she was just Riley. Ethan handed her half of his sandwich, their fingers brushing. The gesture was so familiar, so full of unspoken history, that it made her smile. He didn't see her as a symbol or a success story. He saw the woman who had shared her last dollar, the woman who had taught him how to believe again. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the kids laugh as they figured out a difficult line of code. The sun was warm on her face. She was no longer running, no longer hiding. She was home. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, because their story had been forged in the real world of grit, failure, and forgiveness. It was better. It was an ending they had built together, one act of kindness at a time. If this story moved your heart, made you believe in second chances, or simply reminded you that even the smallest act of kindness can change everything, then you are exactly where you need to be. Here at Soul-Stirring Stories, we bring you tales that speak to the strength of the human spirit, the power of compassion, and the quiet courage it takes to start over. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes all it takes is a sandwich and someone who dares to see the good in you. Subscribe now to soul-stirring stories, where every story is a step toward healing.